Okay, mic check, good. Is that gonna, oh, does it always do that to me? Well, whatever, we'll just bring it back up. All right, so, most of you have done this before, so you know how this works. Whatever goes up on the board is potentially on the test. Again, when it comes to years and dates and all that, unless I emphasize it as being important, it's not that big a deal. But I do like to have dates in the material just for the sake of my own personal mental timeline. I like to sort of keep things chronologically where they're supposed to be. Also, for my online folks, I've been getting a lot of emails, so let me go ahead and mention this now. As far as assignments, you guys don't need to worry about that until the first paper, which again, I don't have a solid date on yet, but it's going to be like the middle of the semester, late February, early March sort of thing. So you guys have over a month at the very least to worry about that. I like to try to keep it in the middle because then the second paper is due at the very end of the semester, and I don't want those to run too close together. Oh, also, I haven't asked you guys yet because you guys were my first class last week, and I wasn't thinking about it. So, the spring break for Francis Marion is like the middle of March, and everyone else in my other two classes said that their spring break was the first week of April. How true is that? True for everybody in here? Most of you guys? Okay, so since that seems to be the case for everybody, I'm going to move spring break to that first week of April because they let us do whatever when it comes to breaks and whatnot. So the week that it's spring break for Francis Marion, we're still going to be here in the middle of March. I think it's like the second or third week. And then the first week of April, you guys do what you got to do, and I'll see you guys after that. So is that good for everybody? Okay, no, I mean, if there's like some major problem with scheduling, whatever, like I said, when it comes to absences, that's up to you. As long as you are here semi-regularly, I'm assuming you're still in my class. So, if you've got to miss days because of a trip or whatever, then do what you got to do. But for the sake of making it easier for everybody, we'll move it to when you guys have spring break. So, I think I did that. I did that last semester and last year, although I do remember last year it being, I was tired by the middle of March, but it'll be fine. Because I think unlike you guys, the semester does end a little bit earlier than your high school semester. So, like middle of March is like the middle of the semester. We're done at the end of April. So I just wanted to make sure that that break didn't like start to run into important end of the semester stuff. Anyway, that's that. Any questions from anybody before we get things going? I will get the syllabus up as soon as I can. I needed to kind of go over it and adjust some dates and stuff, which I haven't done yet. And then I'll put it up on Blackboard. Again, as we finish each chapter, the PowerPoint will go up on Blackboard. For you online folks, which you're not going to hear this until I post it, I'm sure. After each class, I'll post the video on Blackboard for you guys. So, with that all set, let's get into the material. So, the book starts with chapter 14 because the way these textbooks are set up, it's one big book cut in half. So, we start with 14 in case anybody's wondering about that. And it's the Reconstruction era. And, to shorten it for everybody, we had a Civil War, and now we're doing this. So, you guys don't need to worry about anything before this point. Right. So before the Civil War even ended, there were pockets in the South that did have levels of emancipation. Areas that were occupied by Union troops. The example that the book uses is South Carolina Sea Islands. Had freed slaves form their own communities under the protection of the Union troops. However, once the Union troops left, because, the war's over, so they don't need to be stationed down here anymore, the former plantation owners would return and try to exert their power once again, despite the fact that we just fought a war over this. And this is going to be how things are going to go pretty much for the rest of the chapter. Another big example was in Richmond, Virginia in April of 1865. Freed slaves basically celebrating being freed. The book mentions expressed their joy at emancipation by gathering together and singing hymns. From where my bloodline, I'm German and Irish, so when it comes to celebrating, usually it's getting shit-faced drunk and passing out in the middle of the street. Which we will see when we get to the Prohibition and end of Prohibition. It's some really fun images. But here they're getting together and singing hymns, and apparently this was enough that once the Union troops left, the former plantation owners would punish them for getting together and celebrating, which again, my heritage of fighting the English for hundreds of years, usually when it comes to celebration, is getting drunk and breaking things. So getting together and singing hymns is pretty tame for no longer being enslaved. So the Freedmen's Bureau was formed by Congress to deal with this, the full name being Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. So it was more than just aiding those formerly enslaved. It was a larger scale thing, but the main crux of it was aiding those that now were free of slavery but didn't quite have like a legal standing yet. They weren't quite citizens. Most of them couldn't read. So the Freedmen's Bureau was there to step in and try and catch them up to some degree with the rest of the nation. So they provided aid in the form of financial and legal resources, which, again, we'll get to in just a minute. Although one of the first things that the freed blacks wanted to do was find their families again. Because if you guys were here last semester, you'll recall that the slaves were sold, however, with no intention of keeping family units together. So there was a lot of families split up prior to the war. And the Freedmen's Bureau did their best to help out because, again, this was a big process. But a lot of records were destroyed during the war, either through actual warfare or Sherman's March, or just the plantation owners destroying their stuff on the way out to cover up their hand in what was going on. So again, I'm not going to bug you guys with months and years and all of that, but where these things were going on, and obviously the Freedmen's Bureau, that's an easy question to ask, right? That's the sort of stuff that you need to pay attention to. All right. So I have this image because when I was teaching this class originally, it was upstate, and most of them consider going to Myrtle Beach being like a big deal. Um, so here are the Sea Islands, if you're not familiar with where the Sea Islands are, which is to say at the ocean. We got a bunch going down from really the border of Florida all the way up to about the midsection of South Carolina. And then we've got that flat bit where Myrtle Beach is, and for some reason people think they want to go there. And obviously, there's Sea Islands up in North Carolina as well. There's a whole series of barrier islands there. North Carolina's got some interesting coastline as well. But the important thing about this is the Sea Islands were very isolated, so they had sort of already formed their own separate identity from what was going on in the rest of the state. And this idea of emancipation, if temporary, tended to stick there a lot more heavily. So yeah, we've got the various islands here, and most of the plantations were, sugar cane or indigo. You didn't really have too much cotton or tobacco down in the Sea Islands, but they were still good for growing other things. Oh, and rice. Rice was a big deal, too. And then, of course, we have the emancipation. You've got Lincoln there on the left, the soldier there on the right delivering it, and then in the middle here, this idea that it's, not just some law, but a decree passed down from on high. Also, I managed to find this. I believe this was in 1915, so this was the 50-year anniversary of emancipation. This is in Richmond, Virginia, and we've got this, big crowd out celebrating the 50th anniversary of emancipation. It might be there in the corner. I can't quite read the date. So, it's the oldest image I could find when it came to the stuff going on in Richmond. And there we had the Freedmen's Bureau, because, again, as soon as the war was over, the former plantation owners were attempting to reassert their power. Let's see what? Freedmen's Bureau, drawn by... Yeah, okay. That's unfortunately not... We're going to have a lot of stuff from Harper's Weekly later. Oh, right. I forgot about this. I always forget about this. So this is in the book. There were varying views on the Freedmen's Bureau. I mean, obviously, for the abolitionists and, the folks that had just been freed from slavery, it was a pretty big deal, a pretty good thing, pretty big deal. Others, not so happy about it. So this next image is going to be kind of rough, but it's from the time, so... used to keep them in idleness at the expense of the white man. Twice vetoed by the president. We'll get into that president in just a little bit. Made a law by Congress, support Congress, sustain the president, and you protect the white man. So again, this idea of these people have just been freed from slavery. There's this agency that's been put together to protect them and help them basically get started, and immediately there's this backlash of, oh, our tax money's going into paying for these. It's like you're angry because you don't own them anymore. But racism takes all sorts of bents, and unfortunately, you still see this kind of attitude among people. I've got a lot of racist family members. So, yeah, it's a shame that hasn't gone away in 150 years. Anyway, the next major step was education. many of the freed blacks realized that they needed to maintain some level of education in order to maintain their independence. They could better understand politics and policies, maybe one day have a voice, and we'll get to that as well. Needless to say, though, when it came to education in the South, there wasn't a whole lot of funding. Boy, how times have changed. And also with this whole group of people now demanding education, there was very little, well, again, very little support there. So rather than using schoolhouses, often they'd head into courthouses, cotton barns, even a mule stable at one point. I mean, as long as you're in out of the elements to some degree, I mean, a mule stable is certainly not cozy, it would work. Just have some amount of education for people. So the main, where are we at? Oh, that's Johnson. Okay. The main lesson every freed slave wanted to learn was how to read. And may have mentioned this last semester. If not, I'll mention it again. Or if I have, I'll just mention it again. I don't remember where I heard this, but there's a saying that I agree with. Education has two purposes: to teach you how to read, and then to teach you how to question what you read. I assume you all know how to read because I'm not exactly equipped to do that. But after that, you have to learn to think for yourself. When you read something that's not necessarily set in stone. And it's not to say that it's necessarily false information, which, sometimes. But there's biases behind most everything. I mean, even that really racist-ass image we saw a minute ago, the information on there was technically correct. They were using numbers, this amount of money comes from taxes to pay for this. Like, that's technically true. But everything else about like, oh, well, this is being used to let these people be idle, and the white men are the one that are really hurting. It's like, yeah, that's obviously bias. But you can have things that are true said in a way that leads you to a not necessarily true conclusion. So the point being, learn to discern for yourself. Now, when it came to reading, this was important for folks to be able to read labor contracts because oftentimes the people in the South who were, well, I mean, not just the South, people in the business owners, period, like to draw up these very exploitative contracts that the people who were signing them didn't necessarily able to read. And this wasn't just for the freed slaves. Oftentimes, anyone who was poor usually couldn't read, and, a business owner is going to take advantage of whoever. But especially in the case of the newly freed slaves now. However, the main reason they wanted to be able to read was to be able to read the Bible. There was a big religious power behind what was going on, and especially in the South, because a lot of times Southern preachers would only read out of certain parts of the Bible, or in many cases they had their own Bibles that had any reference to like freedom being left out. Because the Bible in some places does very much encourage slavery, or at least allow it. And, obviously they're not going to tell the story about, say, Exodus, where slaves being freed was like a major plot point. But now that they could read the Bible for themselves, which was actually a big deal way back in the Protestant Reformation even, they could, well, read it for themselves and get their own answers. Which, of course, caused black churches to explode in number. We'd already seen a relatively healthy creation of black churches and black pastors before this. You know, we had, what was his name? Richard Allen. So needless to say, this was extremely popular, and churches weren't just a place you went on Sunday to listen to some preacher, but they were the community center. They were the communal place of gathering where you'd come together. Soup kitchens, in particular, political organizing once that became possible. So it wasn't just that now they could read from the Bible, but they had more organization through these churches. So I've got a couple of images here. Freedman School, there in a log cabin. You would often have these white women coming from the north, these abolitionists, to do the teaching, because that was the stereotypical school teacher at the time. But also from this image, and I think the next one as well, it's not just kids. It's not just children learning to read. I think this one might actually be a little bit better in that regard. But you had adults. You had, grown men and women coming in to learn to read because they'd never been able to. They'd never had the opportunity due to either not having the resources or it being forbidden, and if you tried to learn to read, you'd be beaten. So there was a very large demand. Again, it wasn't just the kids. It was just about everybody. There were some older folks that, kind of like with immigration even today, where the younger generations will be more bilingual and the older generations, it's harder to learn a new language as you get older. So a lot of times the older generations would still be illiterate, but from kids to middle-aged adults, they were very interested in being able to do things for themselves. Also, we've got the churches. I've actually got a really good image here of a baptism. Again, being in the South, it's clearly very hot. Everybody out there in their Sunday best with parasols because that sun's beating down at probably 102 degrees, and the humidity's 95%. All right, so on to the Reconstruction proper, beginning with Lincoln, because, he was the president at the end of the war for a little while. So the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, Lincoln issued this in December of 1863, so this was before the war had even ended. They believed the South had not constitutionally seceded from the Union, so they didn't have to do a whole lot to get back in the Union. In other words, they didn't do a very good job of seceding legally, whatever that means. So getting the southern states formally admitted back into the Union wouldn't be a whole ordeal. So the standards he put together, the states had to accept the abolition of slavery because, again, we had a whole war over that. And that 10% of those eligible to vote, which is to say white men, would swear an oath of allegiance to the Union. So no more rebelling, but 10% of half of the white folks in the South needed to say, I'm not a traitor. And that, of course, just completely leaves out the black Americans because them being able to vote is a little ways off. He gave amnesty, but all but the highest-ranking Confederate officials. We'll actually discuss that in a little bit. So within 18 months, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee had agreed to this 10% plan. So 10% of the voting individuals had agreed to not be traitors and had accepted the abolition of slavery. Notice that that's only a few states out of the whole South, so we'll get to that in a little bit. Needless to say, not everybody was on board with this. Our Republicans in Congress, which, again, for those of you new and those of you that need to be reminded, the Republicans were the more liberal party back then, and the Democrats were more conservative. This switches in like the 1950s. Well, a little bit later. It's largely under Nixon, but regardless, just FYI, because Lincoln was a Republican, and he certainly was more for abolition than against. The Republicans in Congress wanted harsher restrictions on the South. They should be seen as conquered provinces under congressional supervision, which we will kind of get to. There was a Wade Davis bill that would have forced 50% of the voting populace to sign an oath, but Lincoln shot it down with a pocket veto. I'm not exactly sure what a pocket veto is compared to a regular veto, because every time I see this, I'm like, I'm going to look it up, and then by the end of class, I forget. So it's a veto. Don't worry about it. However, Lincoln and Congress did work together to some degree. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, except for people who were imprisoned, and wanted to unify the North and the South more quickly because, the war was bad. I mean, it was our deadliest war in history in terms of Americans killed. Obviously, it being fought on American soil and being between an American side and an American side, every casualty was American. But we've not lost more troops in, World War I or World War II or these forever wars we've been in. So it was a pretty big thing. Needless to say, Lincoln wasn't able to get much of this done because John Wilkes Booth shot him. And that actually made things worse for the South. So good work, John Wilkes Booth. You screwed everything up. So Andrew Johnson was now in charge, and Andrew Johnson was probably one of the worst presidents we've ever had. I'll get in. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But Andrew Johnson was pretty terrible. So anyway, here's Lincoln retiring from the presidency. And now to Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. Again, the political landscape back then was a little bit weird. Those of you that weren't here last semester, the very first presidential election when, technically the first presidential election was Washington, but that wasn't really even an election. It was just like, hey, we're putting Washington in charge. And Washington's just like, yeah, okay, I guess. The first proper election between Adams and Jefferson, they hated each other, but Adams won out and Jefferson was in second place, and because they didn't really have like a vice president running mate thing set up yet, they made Jefferson vice president. Because like, well, this will force them to get along, and it didn't work out. But still, even as late as Lincoln, this idea of having someone very different as your running mate in order to pull in more votes from people who maybe didn't agree with you was a lot more common. I mean, obviously today you've got the president runs on such and such platform, and the vice president maybe might have a little extra on the side, but it's never like polar opposite to the person running for president. And also, back then, um, the vice president wasn't really important. Today the vice president sits in on Congress, and in many cases is the deciding vote if there's a 50-50 split. They do a lot of ambassadorial duties. Um, but back then, the vice president, I like to say, it's like the understudy for a play, where you are there in case the person in charge gets sick or, in this case, gets shot. But when everything's going fine, you do nothing. You sit on your hands for 4 years. And Andrew Johnson was really good at sitting on his hands. Unfortunately, he wasn't good at much else. So, Andrew Johnson now being in charge, not being very good at the whole politics thing, and also the personal values he held, which we'll get into in just a second, it made Reconstruction a whole lot worse than it needed to be. And by worse, I mean it didn't really help anybody. So to get into why Johnson was doing what he was doing, he was born into rural poverty. Yeah, can't ever say that properly the first time. Rural poverty. So for him, the enemy was the Southern aristocracy. It was the rich folks in the South. And he used Reconstruction to basically hurt the rich folks in the South, but just like out of petty reasons, not really anything to do with the war. And he was more focused on that than actually extending civil rights to the black population that was now in this weird limbo of not really having rights, but also not being enslaved. His view on slavery was that it was simply a tool that the Southern gentry used to gain more power, as opposed to being a problem at all. It's like, well, good, we're rid of slavery so that the Southern elite don't have that power. What about the people that were enslaved? He didn't really care. So the only real thing he did was making rich Southerners petition to him directly for amnesty. I don't like that. Oh, that's back there. Okay, I thought it was coming from the hallway. Is it coming from the hallway or is it one of you guys? Let's find out. Oh, there it is. That's really loud, and I've got the mic on. Sorry, guys. If anybody smells smoke, let me know. Right, so Johnson made the aristocracy petition to him directly, which was more just to humiliate them. He didn't really do anything to them other than like they had to either come there in person or like send a letter to him. But for the most part, he just let the South take care of things for themselves, which, as we've seen from the Civil War, maybe wasn't a great idea. Most states did agree to the requirements. They had to agree to the 13th Amendment to revoke the ordinances of secession because, again, we had a war over that. And also, they would refuse to pay, well, the Union would refuse to pay Confederate war debts. Basically, besides the South being destroyed economically because they had a war, they had all these war debts, and they were like, well, if we're in the Union again, then the federal government can help pay for the war debts. And Johnson was like, no, you're not. These were debts that you acquired by fighting the Union. Why are we going to pay for your war debts? That'd be like asking Britain to pay for the Revolutionary War. So that didn't quite work out. However, Johnson was very lenient in terms of everything else. Many Confederate officials won elections. In fact, Georgia elected the Vice President of the Confederacy, Andrew Stevens, to the U.S. Senate because Georgia. Leave it to Georgia, right? South Carolina and Mississippi refused to repudiate war debt because, of course, and Mississippi also refused to ratify the 13th Amendment. And, I see that and just think, that wasn't us. South Carolina's often not very good in much of anything we get done. But at least we didn't say, this amendment that, we went to war over, we're just going to not do that and ignore the fact that we just went to war. Also, though, because the South was basically able to do whatever it wanted, black codes were passed which restricted the rights of the black population, bearing arms, intermarriage, jury duty, essentially keeping them as non-citizens. They were technically not enslaved, but they were very much restricted in what they could do as, well, I wasn't going to say as citizens, but the Dred Scott case made it so that they weren't citizens until that gets overturned. We'll look at this image again in a minute. We have the Reconstruction here. Andrew Johnson, again, was depicted like this all the time for some reason. It's like, oh yeah, everything's fine because the Reconstruction's happening. Meanwhile, in the background, people are killing each other, which is to say, mostly groups of white folk going through black neighborhoods and just burning them down. Here we have what's that called? Here's from Harper's Weekly. The event filling the eyes of thousands with tears of joy, Massachusetts and South Carolina, coming arm in arm into the convention, and as you can see here, they're using the term crocodile tears, which is to say, it's all a sham. Oh, right. So I mentioned that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except for those who were in prison. And turns out black codes are codes made specifically, or laws made specifically to target African Americans, tended to get a lot of them in prison because the laws were just, you're breaking the law by not being white. And if they're in prison, then they can technically be used for unpaid labor. So, in a sense, the black codes weren't just something that were arbitrary and unfair, but they were used to essentially maintain slavery. And here we have the Union as it was. We've got the KKK and White League. That phrase there, worse than slavery, Uh, that's saying a lot, but you can be enslaved and have some level of protection, or be free but have zero rights and have people literally just like shooting you in the middle of the night. So, due to the black population being essentially thrown out and left with no recourse, it was very bad. And we'll get to that in just a minute. So, Johnson being easy on the South was not popular among the Republicans. So when the Southern lawmakers returned to Congress in December, they were barred from entry. They were just like told to leave. Johnson denounced this as illegitimate, and this is where the fighting began. So Johnson and Congress are going to go back and forth until we have a winner. And I may have mentioned Johnson wasn't a very good political actor, so good luck to him. So Johnson refused to sign a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. That was that image we had on the last slide, but I've got it again. Vetoed the Civil Rights Act. Okay. The Civil Rights Act was written to protect the freed people from the restrictions of the black codes. And Johnson was so heavy-handed that he actually pushed the moderates and radicals together. Radicals, kind of a negative term, but being the people that thought slavery was maybe a bad thing were considered the radicals at the time. So, whatever. But due to Johnson's handling of things, he had a very large contingent in Congress against him. Johnson argued the Freedmen's Bureau infringed on the rights of the states to handle their own economic affairs. How to treat an entire group of human beings as apparently less than human beings. But, no, that's the state's right. I mean, you still get people even today arguing, well, the Civil War was over states' rights. States' right is to what? Owning people? Yeah, okay. So in April 1866, Congress repassed the Freedmen's Bureau extension and the Civil Rights Act because there was apparently enough of a majority in Congress, which to override a veto, I think, is 2/3. They also adopted the 14th Amendment, basically made the Civil Rights Act from an act into not just a law, but an amendment. Overturned the Dred Scott case, which said blacks were not citizens. Again, immediately after the war, they were in this weird political limbo that was very dangerous, considering the people and often governments of the South wanted to hurt these people for existing. Lawmakers saw very quickly they needed to get things done. There was a very large. There was a huge anti-black riot in Memphis the month before. The book has an image here. For a day and a half, white mobs, egged on by local police, went on a rampage during which they terrorized black residents of the city, burned their houses and churches. The book, again with the image here, skirmish between white policemen and black Union veterans resulted in 3 days of rioting by white mobs that attacked the black community in Memphis, Tennessee. Before federal troops restored peace, numerous women had been raped and 46 African Americans and 2 whites had been killed. So, it's not going well for people in the South who liked being alive. Johnson, being the dick that he was, actually encouraged Southern states to reject the 14th Amendment. Interestingly enough, his home state of Tennessee, which is weird, well, yeah, was actually the first and only state to initially accept the 14th Amendment and thus be left out of what's about to come. So again, Johnson is just like working against his own government at this point. Which again, we'll get to that. So this is the veto, Congress and the Freedmen's Bureau. There's Freedmen written there, and a bureau is an old term for that. Because Johnson was, as I said, just kind of a dick. So, with both moderates and radicals within Congress now against Johnson, they were able to pass things just over his head. He couldn't do anything about it. By this point, even moderates agreed that unless blacks had access to the vote, they'd be unable to maintain their freedom. Because if we're just like, well, you know, people's rights are up to the states are just going to re-enslave them. Like, or at the very least, do like they were doing with the black codes and make it so that it's essentially illegal to be black. And, oh, well, now you're in jail, and now we can legally enslave you again. So by the end of March, Congress had passed 3 military Reconstruction Acts. Obviously, we're not going to have to know all of them, just know that there were military Reconstruction Acts happening. They split the southern states, except Tennessee, because Tennessee was actually behaving, into 5 military districts. Each district would have a Union general and his troops keeping the peace. Each state would, well, all male voters, because they were, again, the only ones, so I should specify white male voters, they were the only ones able to vote. And each state would elect delegates. They would essentially create a new constitution, barring former Confederate officials, because we know where they stand politically, so they're not allowed to run for office. I mean, considering, like, how easy it is to get a felony nowadays, and if you get a felony, you're not allowed to vote and not allowed to run for office and all this other stuff. So the fact that these people who were officials in a government fighting against the United States were not allowed to run for office is pretty minor, I would say. These constitutions needed to guarantee black suffrage and ratify the 14th Amendment. So within a year, North and South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas had done what we were supposed to do and were readmitted to the Union. So 1868, yeah, for most of these states. Now, there were a few that lagged behind, but by 1870, everyone had done what they were supposed to do. But it still took a lot longer than it should have. So with the South under the control of, like, literally generals and their armies, Congress turned its attention back to Johnson because Johnson wasn't sitting on his hands and being a good boy like he was supposed to. He instead was trying to undermine the Reconstruction by using his position as commander-in-chief to tell the generals in the South to basically not do their jobs. So Congress passed the Command of the Army Act, where Johnson had to go through the General of the Army in Washington in order to actually send orders to the generals down in the South. So you have to go through the main general to talk to the other generals. And the main general was Ulysses S. Grant. And considering he led the armies in the Civil War, he wasn't going to relay orders to take it easy on the South. Grant later won the election of 1868, which we'll get to. Congress also passed the Tenure of Office Act, where Johnson was not allowed to remove cabinet members without the approval of the Senate, and then Johnson proceeded to remove cabinet members without the approval of the Senate, and was technically, though not fully, impeached, which is to say the charges were brought up, but there wasn't enough of a vote to actually kick him out of office. But normally, as it was written, if charges are brought up on you at all in Congress, and it's enough that like the proceedings even happen, you should probably stop doing whatever it was you were doing. And even though Johnson was not kicked out of office, the impeachment proceedings were enough to have him settle down and be quiet for the rest of his term, which was good for everyone, including Johnson. Johnson's like the little kid that's just, every time he opens his mouth, he's getting in trouble. It's like, just, if you're quiet, everyone's going to have a better time. This image is in the book. It's not color-coded in the book like it is in this image that I found, so bonus points for me, I guess. But it shows the various districts, the year that they agreed to, let me see. Yeah. They were readmitted to the Union, and the second date is when the conservative rule was reestablished. In some cases, it was immediately after. You see here, Georgia was one of the ones dragging their heels. They weren't readmitted until 1870, but by 1871, conservatives were in charge again. Up here, Virginia actually wasn't readmitted until 1870, but it actually had conservative rule back like just at the start of the previous year, or at the end of the previous year. Also, I wanted to mention that some of this looks uneven. You've got all of Texas and Louisiana in a single zone, but Virginia is its own zone. In terms of population, this made sense. Florida wasn't heavily populated, so having Alabama, Georgia, and Florida in one made sense. Texas was like this region. We ended last semester with the Mexican-American War, well, the start of the Mexican-American War, and it was mostly just like northeastern Texas, and even that wasn't heavily populated. Meanwhile, Virginia was like one of the most populous states in the Union at the time. So that's why that's like that, in case you were wondering. That's nothing you need to know for your test, but in case anybody's like me and is looking at this map, it's like, this doesn't seem right. Why does Sheridan have to have Texas and Louisiana while Schofield is just Virginia? But that's why. Anyway, and there's Grant. We'll talk more about Grant, I think, next chapter, really. We don't get too much into him this chapter. So, the 15th Amendment was passed in 1869. This was meant to protect black suffrage, which was initially passed by the Military Reconstruction Acts. But again, if you want something to stick, it's probably best to make it an amendment. You can go in and change amendments, but you have to make a new one to change it. I mean, that's like with Prohibition. They made an amendment for Prohibition, and to get rid of it, they had to make another amendment. So, the 15th Amendment prohibited discrimination based on race. However, voting could still be denied based on a lot of reasons. Literacy, again, most newly freed slaves could not read. They, again, either didn't have the opportunity or were not allowed at the point of a whip. There was like a poll tax, which it has been a thing since like England, but it's essentially used so that you can say the poor are allowed to vote, but if they can't pay the the poll tax, then they can't vote. So, it's where a law is technically fair, but then you've got another law or rule or whatever that makes it so it doesn't work. Also, this idea of moral character, whatever the hell that means. It's like, oh, we don't think you're of enough moral character to vote, so leave. That one was, I'm sure, used a lot just to be pedantic. So the American Anti-Slavery Society disbanded when slavery ended because, it's in the name. If slavery is over, we don't really need an anti-slavery society. Cool. However, they realized that while that part of their job was done, there was still a lot more going on that they needed to be involved in. So they came back together and formed the American Equal Rights Association to fight for the rights of the free people. Because, again, just because you're no longer enslaved doesn't mean you're now a full-fledged citizen with all the rights and advantages therein. So taking a step back, there were actually concerns among some folks in the population, which is to say women, because the 14th Amendment used the word male in the Constitution for the first time. For the most part, the Constitution was very neutral in how it talked about people. It called them, citizens and the people and, that sort of thing. It didn't really specify men, even though other laws did. But if the Constitution didn't specifically, it'd be a little bit easier to move laws later on. The 15th Amendment also specifically ensured that only men could vote, even though the 15th Amendment did extend suffrage to black Americans, but only to the men. So there were voices, which is to say, mostly women. There were men there too that, I guess, realized that maybe we're all people and should be able to have the same rights. I don't know. It's crazy. Some voices wanted female suffrage over black suffrage because, again, a lot of white women were just as racist as the white men. It's like, why can't we vote if we're letting the black people vote? Others believed that extending the votes to freedmen would pave the way for the female vote. So, sure, this amendment technically specifies only the men can vote, but if we expand suffrage to some degree, then surely it will continue expanding. Unfortunately, that first group was correct in the way things would go. I'm not going to agree with them for what they stood for, but, well, we'll get to that. So we have two groups, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Boy, real different titles there. So the National Women's Suffrage Association opposed the 15th Amendment because, again, they believed that white women should have the right to vote before black men, or just specifically, we should have women enshrined in the right to vote as well before we get to everybody. While the American Women's Suffrage Association, which actually had a lot more pull, attracted men and women, white and black, just everybody came together in support of the 15th Amendment. And so by 1870, the 15th Amendment had been ratified, but women were still excluded. Again, we don't get that until after World War I, I believe. I know Britain's women's suffrage is like right after World War I, and we're after them. So, go America. We got a demonstration here. A woman named Alice Paul apparently had been arrested for demonstrating and wanting to vote, and they're comparing this to someone whose name I can't quite get because it's blurred out a little bit from the quality of the image. Um, Basically, there was a woman in Russia who had agitated for the right to vote and technically had been imprisoned, but not for very long. Meanwhile, in America, we were throwing people in prison for demonstrating and wanting to vote. If you guys ever take my 104 course, we'll get into the suffragettes in Britain, and they were way more aggressive than these gals. The suffragettes in Britain were to the point of being violent. They were pretty cool. So here we have the American Women's Suffrage Association having a meeting. A whole bunch of folks here who are going to speak. Suffrage, songs, and music. And it was a whole thing. Admission free, all are invited. So let's do just a little bit more, and then we can call it. I'm not quite as far as I was in my other class, but we had a bit of an interruption. So Johnson, again, was sitting on his hands like he was supposed to. The Reconstruction got properly underway. Now, obviously, Southern gentry were concerned because, oh no, if this group of people who didn't have rights now have some kind of rights, then we have less rights, even though that's not how rights work. Rights are not a zero-sum game. For the most part, though, whites, and which is to say white men, usually were the ones who were in charge in these various regions. Only one rebel was executed for war crimes, which is the commandant of the Andersonville prison in Georgia. He was doing some bad stuff there. I mean, you know, a prisoner of war camp's never going to be great, but like he was just letting people die of disease and starvation. So he was executed for his war crimes. Only one official actually went to prison, and that was Jefferson Davis, which, if you're not familiar, was the president of the Confederacy. So, like, the guy who's literally in charge of the country that tried to be independent of the United States and do war crimes, he's the only one who went to jail. And it wasn't for very long. I think it was like 7 years. And I want to say he was like pardoned after a little while. It wasn't a huge, it's not like he went to jail for the rest of his life. It's not like he died in prison. And within 7 years of the war, most folks who had fought on the side of the Confederacy could now vote and hold office. So again, apparently fighting a war against the United States isn't a felony back then. So at the start of the Reconstruction, there were two groups of whites who had the majority of the power to create the constitutions and govern the states. So there were the Republicans in the South who had opposed the secession to begin with. They were usually merchants and folks living in the mountains, those that weren't involved in slavery and felt like seceding from the Union was a dumb idea. They were called scalawags, which is another term for scoundrels, which is to say the Southern Democrats saw them as traitors. You know, the ones who didn't want to do treason against the United States are considered traitors. The other group were Northerners who headed down to the South to aid with Reconstruction. They were seen as coming to plunder the resources of the South and take it back home. They were the ones called carpetbaggers. You may have heard of these groups in your high school classes. Although I recall learning that they were objectively like bad people, that how dare they oppose the South that had gone to war against the United States. So though they were not in the majority to any degree, there was still some amount of political movement among the blacks in the South because, at least with the Reconstruction Acts and eventually 15th Amendment, black men could vote. They could exercise the right to vote, hold office. and working with sympathetic whites because you still needed to have whites on your side. They helped to shape the politics. Sharecropping was the typical agricultural agreement of the day, which is not something you ever want to be on the poor side of. You basically help on a farm, you're given a tiny little plot of land to grow your own stuff, and that's never enough to actually make any money. And the Exodusters, which was a fun name I wanted to include, these were black communities that began moving Midwest as the blacks were leaving the South. This group we'll actually talk about again later. During the Dust Bowl, they continue to move westward while all that's going on. And again, here's some propaganda that, like, I was taught growing up. Carpetbaggers is pitifully plain. Use Southern defeat for personal gain. It's like, okay, what caused the defeat of the South? Why did they go to war? Oh, right. They wanted to keep people as property. Why do we feel bad for them? I mean, it's got a Snidely Whiplash mustache and everything. I mean, it's very biased in how this is being presented. And then just real quick, I've got this image to compare carpetbaggers and scalawags. Again, scalawags were seen as traitors. They were the Republicans in the South. And carpetbaggers are Northerners who came down. Here's what a carpetbag looks like. It's a bag made out of like this gross carpet material. Oh, there's the Exodusters. I think that's, yeah. All right, we're going to move on more next time, next Monday, since it's already Wednesday. So yeah, see you guys later.